Chapter 4 Ideal Superstructures. Section 1. If the argument of the last chapter stands, standard readings of Marx's base superstructure metaphor must evidently fall. Base and, quote, superstructure cannot be consistently delineated across modes of production as exclusive, substantially defined, quote, levels of the social formation. This in turn undermines the possibility of erecting any general theory of the base superstructure relation of a causal or functional sort, since to do so would presuppose the substantial character of the distinction. This, we should note, applies as much to, quote, relative autonomy models as straightforward economic determinisms. The question then arises, what did Marx intend to convey by his use of the base superstructure imagery, the base superstructure imagery? For it is undeniably common in his work, if not the leitmotif it is often taken to be. Cohen's account may again serve as a convenient, if indirect, starting point. Unlike most Marxists, Cohen seeks to exclude Marx's, quote, forms of social consciousness from the superstructure and reserve the concept for, quote, economic institutions, leaving aside the obvious question of how we might begin sensibly to describe human institutions without reference to the ideas social institutions embody. It is difficult to reconcile this exclusion with Marx's own use of the term superstructure. At a pinch, it fits the 1859 preface, but it demonstrably conflicts with other texts. We have already seen in Engels, in his late letters, referring to the whole superstructure as, quote, ideal or, quote, idealistic, adjectives which make little sense except as applied to forms of consciousness. This was also Marx's usage, not at least as many occasions as not. This was Marx's own usage on at least as many occasions as not. The German ideology, for instance, speaks of, quote, the state and the rest of the idealistic superstructure, end quote, and, quote, family and political relations, together with their entire ideological superstructure, end quote. An interesting formulation, since it here seems to be family and political relations, the latter eminently superstructural, the former ignored in standard accounts, which serve as the base to a superstructure which is entirely ideological. In the 18th Brumaire, Marx writes similarly that, quote, upon the different forms of property, upon the social conditions of existence, rises an entire superstructure of different and distinctly formed sentiments, illusions, modes of thought, and views of life. The entire class creates and forms them out of its material foundations and out of the corresponding social relations, end quote. 18th Brumaire. With the last quote, incidentally, but a point I shall return to in my final chapter, we are in a different language game to that in which the base superstructure issue is generally posed. Instead of the silent dance of structural, quote, correspondences, we glimpse the creative and conscious activity of real individuals. At the very least, then, quote, social forms of consciousness, unquote, were certainly part of what Marx understood by the, quote, superstructure. Cohen thinks it a relatively trivial matter whether or not we classify them as such. I do not view it as a trivial matter. For I believe that Marx's references to the superstructure as, quote, ideal or, quote, idealistic hold the key to his entire base superstructure metaphor. The, quote, superstructure, in brief, is simply the, quote, ideal form in which the totality of, quote, material relations, which make up the, quote, base itself, are manifested to consciousness, not a substantially separable order of reality at all. Arguing this will take some time. Let me begin with an apparent digression. Section 2. Marx, of course, held a materialist view of consciousness. For him, quote, life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life, end quote. In the words of the 1859 preface, quote, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, men's social being that determines their consciousness, end quote. The problem, however, is what exactly Marx meant by such claims. A common interpretation, epitomized in the works of Plekhanov or the younger Lenin, is to read Marx as inverting the primacy of the, quote, ideal, consciousness, thought, ideas, over the, quote, material world, allegedly asserted in German idealist and particularly Hegelian and post-Hegelian philosophy. Where Hegel held that the ideal determined the material, Marx argued the contrary. In a famous formulation, he found the Hegelian dialectic, quote, standing on its head, and turned the Hegelian dialectic, quote, right side up again, end quote. Marx was thus like his materialist philosophical precursors in that, in Lenin's words, he, quote, takes matter as primary and regards consciousness, thought, sensation as secondary, end quote. Marx's specific novelty and debt to Hegel consists in conceiving of matter itself, quote, dialectically. In my view, Marx's critique of idealism involves something quite different from, and very much more radical than, this straightforward inversion of idealism's supposed order of priorities. And the inversion metaphor is in important ways misleading. What Marx does in criticizing Hegel and his, quote, left followers, such as Stirner, Bauer, and the rest, is first and foremost to deny the very existence of the, quote, ideal as a separable entity. The, quote, cunning of reason, or the so-called spirit of the age, Hegel's Weltgeist, the young Hegelians, quote, self-consciousness, and so on, cannot for Marx be the subjects of history for the simple reason that they do not exist. Cunning of reason, spirit of the age, and self-consciousness are reifications, philosophers' fictions, abstractions made flesh, speculative constructions, just like in the, quote, fruit example we considered in the last chapter. Marx's central criticism of idealist history is that it is, quote, an imagined activity of imagined subjects, end quote. Marx ridicules what is involved in thus being, quote, German, profound, and speculative, end quote, on numerous occasions. The most famous of these is probably the Holy Family's discussion of the, quote, mystery of speculative construction, end quote, on which I drew in the last chapter. Here is another such recipe. Quote, the whole trick of proving the hegemony of the spirit in history is confined to the following three efforts. Number one must separate the ideas of those ruling for empirical reasons, under empirical conditions, and as empirical individuals, from these actual rulers, and thus recognizing the rule of ideas and illusions in history. Number two, one must bring an order into this rule of ideas, prove a mystical connection among the successive ruling ideas, which is managed by regarding the successive ruling ideas as, quote, acts of self-determination on the part of the concept, end quote. Number three, to remove the mystical appearance of this, quote, self-determining concept. It is changed into a person, quote, self-consciousness, or to appear thoroughly materialistic into the, quote, thinkers, the, quote, philosophers, the ideologists, who are once again understood as the manufacturers of history, end quote. 1846. With such, quote, conjuring tricks, one second. With such, quote, conjuring tricks, consciousness ceases to be an attribute of real individuals and is instead transformed into an independently acting historical subject in its own right. The, quote, spirit of the age, or whatever. The concept of an attribute is mistakenly concretized as an entity. In Marx's words, quote, first of all, an abstraction is made from a fact. Then it is declared that the fact is based upon the abstraction, end quote. Marx's denial of the determining role of the ideal in history then is based on a prior denial of the very existence of the ideal as a separable entity. Consciousness is precisely not a thing in itself, and the fundamental error of the idealists is to treat consciousness as a thing in itself. To attribute to, quote, concepts, thoughts, ideas, in fact, all the products of consciousness, an independent existence, end quote. Where for idealism, quote, the starting point is consciousness, taken as the living individual, end quote. Marx's starting point is the, quote, real living individuals themselves, and consciousness is considered solely as their consciousness. Consciousness is, quote, my relationship to my surroundings. End quote. Consciousness, quote, can never be anything else than conscious existence, end quote. These passages all come from the German ideology. But nearly 30 years later, In that same text in which Marx speaks of setting the Hegelian dialectic, quote, right side up again, end quote, his criticism is exactly the same, that the ideal subject of Hegel's historiography is a purely fictitious subject. Quote, to Hegel, the life process of the human brain, i.e. the process of thinking, which, under the name of the, quote, idea, Hegel even transforms into an independent subject, is the demiurgos of the real world. And the real world is only the external phenomenal form of the, quote, idea. With me, on the contrary, the ideal is nothing else than the material world reflected by the human mind and translated into forms of thought. End quote. Marx. Idealism's historical subjects are constituted by first abstracting, then reifying what is in fact merely a predicate, consciousness, of real subjects. But Marx's critique is less an inversion of the subject-predicate relation than an insistence that such predicates cannot, in the nature of things, be subjects at all. The only subjects of history, Marx insists, are, quote, real living individuals, end quote, themselves. The quotations I have given so far argue the fictitious status of the ideal, which is my main concern in this chapter, given that Marx and Engels repeatedly qualified, quote, superstructures thus. But it is equally important to realize that the other term in the equation, the material, the quote material, is also and ipso facto transformed. If consciousness ceases to be regarded as a, quote, living individual, but instead is recognized as an attribute or predicate of, quote, real living individuals, end quote, themselves, then the material existence of these individuals can no longer be conceptualized in ways that exclude their consciousness. The material premise from which historical materialism starts is not abstractly, quote, matter as opposed to, quote, spirit, or Lenin's, quote, consciousness, thought, sensations, end quote. The material premise from which historical materialism starts is, quote, real individuals, the real individual's activity, and the material conditions under which real individuals live, end quote. Real individuals who are, amongst other things, conscious and act on the basis of their conceptions. We have seen that such purposeful action is what, for Marx, defines labor as a distinctively human activity and differentiates labor from superficially analogous phenomenon like the, quote, labors of bees and beavers elsewhere in the natural world. This is, of course, the burden of Marx's famous theses on Feuerbach. The fault in Feuerbach's materialism, which among other things renders Feuerbach's materialism ahistorical, is that, quote, the thing, reality, sensuousness, is conceived only in the form of the object, but not as sensuous human activity, practice, not subjectively, end quote. This, quote, active side was developed abstractly by idealism, end quote. Stirner's understanding of, quote, matter is similarly dismissed as, quote, an abstraction, an idea, end quote. Empiricism branded as, quote, still abstract, because empiricism treats history as a collection of, quote, dead facts, and, quote, so-called objective historiography, end quote, denounced as, quote, reactionary, because empiricism apprehends, quote, the historical conditions independent of activity, end quote. A quarter of a century later, Marx was to reiterate this dismissive characterization of, quote, objective historiography, end quote, in connection with a reissue of his 18th Brumaire, a text concerned centrally with the puzzle of how an individual, Louis Bonaparte, could come to play the central historical role he did. Marx is precisely unlike his materialist precursors in his inclusion within what he understood as the realm of material life of those attributes of human beings, the, quote, active side, which were previously separated off under the illusory guise of the ideal. Indeed, what Marx retained from the idealist tradition, whilst resituating it in terms of the natural history of humanity rather than the biography of spirit, was a conception of the internality of the relations between what Spinoza called thought and extension. The reason inversion is so inadequate a metaphor for this critique should by now be evident. The metaphor suggests a simple reversal of terms, quote, material and, quote, ideal, which leaves their reference intact. But what Marx actually does is to challenge these terms themselves. Marx denies the validity of the distinctions of material and ideal as previously drawn, including by materialists, in the first place. And it is the presumed separability of the material and the ideal which forms the specific target of Marx's attack. Material and ideal can be separated for the social world only at the cost of the, quote, abstraction or reification of both. Note the exact words in which, for instance, Marx criticizes Proudhon in another text of 1846. Quote, because Proudhon places eternal ideas, the categories of pure reason, on the one side, and human beings, and the human being's practical life, which according to Proudhon is the application of these categories, on the other, one finds with Proudhon from the beginning a dualism between life and ideas, between soul and body, a dualism which recurs in many forms. You can see how this antagonism is nothing but the incapacity of Proudhon to understand the profane origin and the profane history of the categories which Proudhon deifies. End quote. Marx, 1846. It is Proudhon's very dualism, the, quote, antagonism of life and ideas that Marx rejects. Certainly this has the corollary that history is to be explained from, quote, living individuals, and not the individual's consciousness or its products, considered an artificial abstraction or isolation. But this is a corollary, and it is the main argument from which it follows that it is of most relevance here. For the argument implies, amongst other things, that the sense of, quote, determination in such propositions as, quote, social being determines consciousness, end quote, cannot be the standard causal one. the standard causal sense of determination, in which the related terms are seen as being merely externally or contingently connected. Section 3. Now it is notable, and it usually goes totally unremarked in commentary, that the structure of Marx's argument against the historical primacy of ostensibly other elements of what is normally taken to be the superstructure, in particular law and state, is identical with that of his critique of idealism. Marx's denial of superstructural primacy, just as with that of the primacy of the ideal more generally, rests on a prior denial of superstructural independence, relative or otherwise. Thus, the German ideology uncompromisingly avers that, quote, morality, religion, metaphysics, all the rest of ideology and their corresponding forms of consciousness, no longer retain the semblance of independence. Morality, religion, metaphysics have no history, no development, but men, developing their material production and their material intercourse, alter, along with this, their real existence, their thinking and the products of their thinking. End quote. Marx, German Ideology. Marx extends the argument quite explicitly to the institutions of politics and law. Quote, it must not be forgotten that law has just as little an independent history as religion. End quote. The idea that politics is, quote, an independent sphere of activity, which develops in its own way, end quote, is an idea, quote, shared by all ideologists, end quote. Quote, there is no history of politics, law, science, etc., of art, religion, etc., end quote. I shall exemplify this argument in detail with regard to state and law below, but first, let us consider further what kind of argument it is. If, with Cohen and, quote, traditional historical materialism, unquote, and with, quote, relative autonomy theorists, we see the, quote, economic structure of society as exclusive of morality, law, religion, science, art, politics, and the rest, then we have to conclude from these curt propositions that Marx was indeed an economic determinist, and a pretty vulgar economic determinist at that. This is implausible given the oft-remarked undeterministic character of any of his substantive historical analyses, like the 18th Brumaire or Part 8 of Capital Volume 1. What Marx actually says in these passages, however, is rather different. His concern is to deny that law, religion, politics, and so on have a history in themselves, which is independent of that of production and production social relations. Marx does not say these are epiphenomenal, secondary, subordinate, or otherwise marginal factors in history as such. The two claims are very different. Marx's point, in fact, a mirror image of Acton's criticism of his supposed position, is that law, state, and so on have no existence independent of people's, quote, materialistic connection, end quote. This is why, like the subjects of idealistic philosophy generally, they cannot in themselves be seen as the motive forces of history. Like, quote, consciousness, they have no existence, quote, in themselves. To treat them as independent entities is to reify them. But this does not, in logic or in Marx's texts, entail a denial or downgrading of their historical import as such. Indeed, if they are inseparable from people's, quote, material production and material intercourse, end quote, and the latter is held to be, quote, basic to society and history, such a conclusion would be somewhat self-contradictory. In this connection, it is worth pausing over a much-discussed footnote to Capital Volume 1. Marx is defending his formulation in the 1859 preface against the charge that, quote, all this is very true for our own times in which material interests predominate, but not for the Middle Ages in which Catholicism, nor for Athens and Rome where politics reigned supreme, end quote. Marx goes on, quote, this much, however, is clear, that the Middle Ages could not live on Catholicism, nor the ancient world on politics. On the contrary, it is the mode in which they gained a livelihood which explains why here politics and there Catholicism played the chief part, end quote. Certainly there is room for argument as to exactly how, quote, the mode in which they gained a livelihood, end quote, explains why religion and politics, respectively, quote, played the chief part, end quote, in the life of these societies. Althusser, for instance, invokes this passage in defense of his, quote, structural causality, end quote. My point, however, is that nothing Marx says here denies that politics in antiquity and Catholicism in the Middle Ages actually, quote, did reign supreme. Marx's argument, then, is about how law, the state, religion, and so forth should be conceived. It is not, or at least not primarily, about their causal status, determinate or determined in history. That they are denied causal primacy is a consequence of Marx's prior denial of their very separability. If they cannot in themselves determine or explain historical development, this is because they have no separable existence in themselves. But this does not mean, when properly conceived, not, quote, in themselves, but as, quote, organically related, end quote, to people's productive activities, they lack causal efficacy. Engels makes this very clear. In one of the letters I cited in Chapter 1, he says it is, quote, ridiculous to assume that, quote, because we deny an independent historical development to the various ideological spheres which play a part in history, we also deny them any effect on history, end quote. Engels, 1893. The structural similarity between Marx's critique of idealism and Marx's analysis of, quote, ideological spheres is striking. I believe this to be more than a coincidence. Marx attacks the independence of, quote, superstructures in the same terms as he attacks idealism's fictitious historical subjects, because Marx believes, quote, superstructures actually to be idealizations comparable to the philosopher's, quote, speculative constructions, end quote. They are constituted in the same way as Hegel's Geist or Stirner's self-consciousness. Law, state, religion, and so on can be conceived as independent, self-acting spheres only by virtue of a reification of exactly the sort idealism engages in with regard to consciousness. In reality, they do not exist without. It says out with. I'm not used to seeing that word. If that's a word, then learning something new today. In reality, they do not exist out with people's, quote, materialistic connection, end quote. For Marx, quote, superstructures are not, as superstructures immediately appear to be, levels of reality which are substantially separate from the so-called base. So-called superstructures, rather, are, ideological forms of appearance, Erscheinungsformen, to use his own concept, of the totality of social relations which make up that base itself, and their ideologically consists. Oh, excuse me. I gotta reread that whole sentence. Superstructures are rather ideological forms of appearance, Erscheinungsformen, to use his own concept, of the totality of social relations which make up that base itself, and their ideologicality. Dude, I'm so impressed that I said that first go. Ideologicality consists precisely in their appearance of real independence. The proper interpretive context for Marx's metaphor of basis and superstructure, then, is that of his critique of ideology. Superstructures, contrary to Cohen, are the, quote, social forms of consciousness, end quote, in which, quote, the essential relations of society are immediately grasped, and these essential relations analysis is coterminous with Marx's critique of immediate appearances. I misread that. Superstructures, contrary to Cohen, are the, quote, social forms of consciousness, in which the, quote, essential relations of society are immediately grasped, and their analysis is coterminous with Marx's critique of immediate appearances. Alasdair MacIntyre argued similarly, and correctly drew attention to the relevance here of Marx's Hegelian background long ago. Quote, as Marx depicts it, the relation between basis and superstructure is not only not mechanical, the relation between basis and superstructure is not even causal. What may be misleading is Marx's Hegelian vocabulary. Marx certainly talks of the basis, quote, determining the superstructure, and of a, quote, correspondence between basis and superstructure. But the reader of Hegel's logic will realize that what Marx envisages is something to be understood in terms of the way, the nature of the concept of a given class, for example, may determine the concept of membership of that class. The economic basis of society is not its tools, but the people cooperating using those particular tools in the manner necessary to their use, and the superstructure consists in the social consciousness molded by and the shape of this cooperation. Creating the basis, you create the superstructure. Creating the basis and creating the superstructure are not two activities, but one activity, end quote. Quoted in Thompson. That was Alasdair MacIntyre. If this reading is correct, to construe the base superstructure metaphor as a model of the relation between substantially discrete levels, practices, or, quote, instances within the social formation, and conceptualize that relation in causal or functional terms, is to replicate exactly the ideological illusion of superstructural separability Marx is above all concerned to confute. Such constructions spectacularly miss the central point of his argument. The base superstructure metaphor applies to the relation between social being and social consciousness. It is not a putative model of societal levels at all. We might recall here the several occasions in Engels' late letters, and comparable passages can also be cited from Marx, on which he relates base and superstructure as respectively content and form. For Marx, the analytic reification of superstructures, like the fetishes considered in Chapter 1, speaks of real social process of estrangement. Given his views on consciousness, it would be surprising if this were not the case. Marx sees, quote, ideas, categories, end quote, as being but, quote, the abstract ideal expression of social relations, end quote. Accordingly, where, as in capitalism, social relations take on the mystifying form of the, quote, violence of things, end quote, social relations, quote, abstract ideal expression, unquote, is likely to be a reified one. The German ideology explicitly develops this argument. Quote, within the division of labor, relationships are bound to acquire independent existence in relation to individuals. All relations can be expressed in language only in the form of concepts. That these general ideas and concepts are looked upon as mysterious forces is the necessary result of the fact that the real relations, of which these general ideas and concepts are the expression, have acquired independent existence. Marx, 1846. The Grundrisse advances a similar thesis, contrasting the relatively transparent personal dependency relations of pre-capitalist societies, kinship and Herrschaft, with the, quote, objective dependency relations, end quote, of the capitalist market. Marx argues that, quote, these objective dependency relations also appear in antithesis to those of personal dependency. The objective dependency relation is nothing more than social relations which have become independent and now enter into opposition to the seemingly independent individuals, i.e. the reciprocal relations of production, separated from and autonomous of individuals, in such a way that individuals are now ruled by abstractions, whereas earlier they depended on one another. The abstraction or idea, however, is nothing more than the theoretical expression of those material relations which are their lord and master. Relations can be expressed, however, only in ideas, and thus philosophers have determined the reign of ideas to be the peculiarity of the new age, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. It was at such abstractions, rather than relations of which those abstractions were the expression, that the young Hegelians characteristically tilted. The objective of Marx's critique was to refocus attention on the relations themselves, to locate the secret of the, quote, holy family in the, quote, earthly family. In Marx's later writings, a distinction between the substance of, quote, essential relations and the variously misleading, quote, phenomenal forms in which they present themselves to consciousness is a systematic organizing principle of his critique of capitalism. Marx held that, quote, science would be superfluous if the outward appearance and the essence of things directly coincided, end quote. And that in general, quote, it is only the direct form of manifestation of relations that is reflected in people's brains and not their inner connection, end quote. In capitalism, though not in all society, these two diverge. Patrick Murray, criticizing Marx's method, has suggested that Marx leans heavily here on Hegel's distinctive logic of essence, quote, which can be typified in the phrase, quote, the essence must appear as something other than itself, namely the phenomenon, end quote. Under certain conditions, essential relations necessarily appear to their subjects in misleading forms, and Marx's critique of appearance shows why this should be the case, in terms of the character of the underlying relations themselves. In Murray's words, quote, Marx works with a non-traditional model that conceives of the discrepancies between essence and appearance to be a necessary consequence of the very nature of the essence, end quote. I have exemplified this above for commodity and capital fetishism. This Hegelian logic of essence is for Marx, accurately, expressive of a specifically alienated social reality. The, quote, enchanted, perverted, topsy-turvy world, end quote, of capitalism, with its, quote, personification of things and the conversion of production relations into entities, end quote. Only such a logic can penetrate this, quote, religion of everyday life, end quote. Again, we see Marx's persistent analogy between religious and other fetishes. In this sense, Lenin was quite right when he famously observed that capital could not be fully understood without reference to Hegel's logic. It is exactly such Erscheinungsformen which comprise Marx's superstructure. It is the discrepancy between essential relations and the misleading forms in which essential relations are experientially manifested, which makes sense, I am tempted to say, which alone can make sense, of his repeated characterization of superstructures as ideal or ideological. This argument has an unsurprising corollary. For those who have followed my reconstruction of historical materialism thus far, that the base superstructure metaphor has been understood in the way it conventionally has, that the base superstructure metaphor has been understood in the way it conventionally has, is itself readily explicable in terms of Marx's own, quote, logic of essence. It is an ideological consequence of the fact that within capitalism, social relations of production do manifest themselves phenomenally, in the form of ostensibly independent economic and non-economic, quote, spheres. Here as elsewhere, quote, traditional historical materialism, end quote, uncritically takes appearance for reality. It grounds its analytic categories on the, quote, natural, self-understood forms of social life, end quote, of the bourgeois world, whose characteristics traditional historical materialism then proceeds to unhistorically generalize to all social formations. It is the depth, the tenacity, the sheer massive obviousness of these capitalist Erscheinungsformen that makes what Marx was saying so eternally difficult to grasp. Section 4. I shall shortly exemplify this argument with regard to Marx's analyses of state and law. But first, a clarification. I have tentatively suggested the identification of superstructures and Erscheinungsformen elsewhere, but in ways which are likely to be misleading. The same goes more generally for my account of ideology in Marx's method. My concern there, as here, was to deny the independence both of consciousness from experience and of politics, law, and so on, from what Marx understood by, quote, economic structure. My language, however, tended to suggest that the relations at issue could be adequately comprehended in terms of structural, quote, correspondences. This was unintentional, but I would now be more cautious. In talking of the economic structure of society, we should never forget, and Marx rarely did, that we are talking of relations between living, acting, thinking, and above all, historical individuals, real men and women. Far from dichotomizing society and the individual, structure and action, Marx is insistent throughout his work that, quote, above all, we must avoid postulating society as an abstraction vis-a-vis the individual. The individual is the social being, end quote. Quote, my existence is social activity, end quote. Society has no existence independent of individuals. Quote, society's only subjects are the individuals, but individuals in mutual relationships, which individuals produce and reproduce anew, end quote. These relations, moreover, are always in the process of formation and transformation. Marx's continual revolutionizing in practical activity of circumstances and selves, quote, structure, thus resolves into activities. Quote, ideological superstructures, understood as the forms in which these relations are experientially apprehended, likewise do not mechanically arise, except in analytic shorthand. Indeed, I would now argue that the blanket term ideology is inadequate, except for the most abstract analytic purposes, to elucidate the multiple and complex ways in which social being is articulated in the social consciousness of individuals. It is too blunt an instrument to embrace, for instance, languages, symbols, moralities, artifacts, myths, faiths, traditions, customs, all of these, moreover, more or less institutionalized in churches, legal systems, political rituals, and so on. The concept of ideology has suffered the fate of many in Marx. Where for Marx, ideology's primary use was adjectival and descriptive of qualities, illusoriness, class basis, etc., which some particular historical forms of consciousness had, it has become reified as itself descriptive of a supposed real entity. a noun which sails through history innocent of any references to real individuals and the lives real individuals lead. And as Marx remarks against Stirner, concepts, quote, if they are divorced from the empirical reality underlying those concepts, can be turned inside out like a glove, end quote. It is people, not individuals in the abstract, but definite socially and historically located individuals who have ideas, build and modify institutions, shape their world. The process through which being is, quote, expressed in consciousness is an active process. An appropriate image of this is a picture of a sculptor creating something genuinely novel, but always out of materials, physical and cultural, which constrain and in that sense determine what can be made of those materials. Marx thought the ultimate basis of people's consciousness lay in their experience, which is why it makes sense to seek to ground an explanation of its ideologicality, where such a claim is made, in Erscheinungsformen. But we have hardly begun to explain, with this presumption, the actual empirical forms. Think of millenarianism, rough music, carnival, or grands purs, which social consciousness assumes in actual history. It is a starting point, no more. Least of all, can we simply, quote, read off forms of consciousness from the bare concept of a, quote, mode of production, or its abstractly specified, quote, essential relations. In the final analysis, the relation between social being and social consciousness can only be elucidated historically, over time, through empirical investigation of, in Marx's words, exactly how, quote, people make their own history, but not of their own free will, not under circumstances they themselves have chosen, but under the given and inherited circumstances with which they are confronted, end quote. Amongst these, quote, given and inherited circumstances, end quote, I would add, the cultural legacy of the past must be reckoned a powerful material constituent of the present, framing present experience, informing, quote, phenomenal forms. Societies exist in time and cannot be made sense of otherwise. Erscheinungsformen equally have a historical dimension, even if it is never independent of people's, quote, materialistic connection. Forms of consciousness cannot adequately be analyzed statically or synchronically. We cannot begin to understand, for instance, the phenomenal forms of the, quote, modern English state without invoking the traditions symbolized and materialized in Magna Carta, Parliament, and the common law, without remembering that England is an old Protestant country, or even, some would argue, without comprehending the long reach of the cultural and institutional heritage of Anglo-Saxon England. It is not irrelevant to the etiology of social forms of consciousness in England that, for instance, county boundaries were with few exceptions continuous from before the Norman conquest in 19... Shit, I don't think that's right. I don't know what the year... It says 1974. Oh, no, shit, never mind. I misread the sentence. That's why it's not making sense. It is not irrelevant to the etiology of social forms of consciousness in England that, for instance, county boundaries were with few exceptions continuous from before the Norman conquest to 1974. Counties are not just names on maps. Counties are real repositories of historical experience. Such, quote, traditions, themselves contested. Think of the centuries-long, quote, myth of the Norman yoke, or the differential meanings of, quote, English liberties, end quote, are formative of individuals' social identities, of precisely their, quote, social forms of consciousness and self-consciousness. The, quote, arising of, quote, superstructures, in short, cannot be directly comprehended through some structural or functional logic. It needs rather to be painstakingly and empirically traced through time, as without doubt constrained, but also without doubt active, social formation, to give that unusually static term a more historical nuance than it is usually granted. Theory alone, no matter how elegantly formulated, provides no shortcuts here to knowledge. This caution should be borne in mind in all that follows. It is essentially theory alone, Jesus Christ. It needs rather to be painstakingly and empirically traced through time, as without doubt constrained, but also without doubt active, social formation, to give that usually static term a more historical nuance than it is usually granted. Theory alone, no matter how elegantly formulated, provides no shortcuts here to knowledge. This caution should be borne in mind in all that follows. It is essentially what I drew from Engel's, quote, testament in chapter 1. Base and superstructure are in the end metaphors. And what Marx had to say about base and superstructure in the 1859 preface was never intended to be any more than a, quote, guiding thread. Section 5. It is time to substantiate these arguments. I shall make Marx's analysis of those two closely linked institutional realms, which for Cohen are superstructures par excellence, state and law. We may begin once more in the 1840s. E.P. Thompson has argued that Marx's texts of this period are significantly wider in the scope of their historical sociology than his later, supposedly more, quote, mature writings, and that his critical focus on political economy in the 1850s and 1860s brought losses as well as gains. Certainly this case can be persuasively made for Marx's 1840s analysis of state and law. Marx himself acknowledged in the 1860s that, quote, the relations of the different state forms to the different economic structures of society, end quote, was something he did not deal with adequately in Capital, and others might find it difficult to do on the basis provided there. Early in 1845, Marx signed a contract with Darmstadt publisher Leska for a work whose proposed title, an instructive title, was, quote, The Critique of Politics and Political Economy, end quote. Marx never delivered. But his plans for his, quote, economics included a, quote, book on the state at least until 1862. Had such a book materialized, it might have amplified a pregnant remark. It might have amplified on a pregnant remark of 1843. Quote, the establishment of the political state and the dissolution of civil society into independent individuals whose relations with one another depend on law, just as relations of men in the system of guilds and estates depended on privilege, is accomplished by one and the same act, end quote. Marx says much the same in another manuscript of the same year, using slightly different terms. Quote, the political constitution as such is brought into being only where the private spheres have won an independent existence. Where trade and landed property are not yet free and have not yet become independent, the political constitution does not yet exist. The abstraction of the state as such belongs only to modern times, because the abstraction of private life belongs only to modern times. The abstraction of the political state is a modern product, end quote. Marx, 1843. The political state, the state as such, is then for Marx a historical phenomenon, coterminous with the establishment of a civil society of independent individuals whose mutual relations depend on law. In view of my arguments in the earlier sections of this chapter, we should not let pass unremarked Marx's description here of both the state and private life as, quote, abstractions. In many of his earliest writings, as here, Marx employed the concept of civil society to refer to what he was, excuse me. In many of his earliest writings, as here, Marx employed the concept of civil society to refer to what he was in the German ideology to call, quote, forms of intercourse, Verkehrsform, and later clarify as relations of production, Produktionsverhältnisse. Produktionsverhältnisse. I think that's actually how you say it. Anyway, relations of production. He took the concept from Hegel, who in turn had it from 18th century French philosophers via Adam Smith. Thereafter, interestingly, the term civil society does not disappear entirely from Marx's lexicon. Marx uses the term civil society in his autobiographical sketch in the 1859 preface to refer to, quote, the totality of the, quote, material conditions of life, whose, quote, autonomy he says there is to be sought in, political economy. More significantly, perhaps, the concept of civil society surfaces again in the Civil War in France, in connection once more with the analysis of the modern state. I have suggested elsewhere that this is part of a wider set of neglected continuities between Marx's 1840s and post-1870 writings, which reinforces Thompson's point about the relative narrowing of focus in the texts of the intervening years, and suggests that any simple dismissal of the 1840s analyses of the state as, quote, immature is ill-considered. The later Marx continued to see civil society and the, quote, political state as coeval phenomena. Although Marx notes in the German ideology that the concept of civil society is conventionally extended to embrace, quote, the social organization evolving directly out of production and commerce, which in all ages forms the basis of the state and the rest of the idealistic superstructure, end quote. He makes it clear that civil society is, in fact, a historical category in both its origins and its specific reference. Quote, the term civil society, Marx says, quote, emerged in the 18th century when property relations had already extricated themselves from the ancient and medieval community. Civil society as such develops only with the bourgeoisie. End quote. Marx, 1846. The term bürgerliche Gesellschaft indeed translates both as civil and as bourgeois society. The 1857 introduction to the Grundrisse extends this argument and takes further the theme of, quote, the dissolution of civil society into independent individuals, end quote. Here Marx contends that the, quote, isolated individuals who form the theoretical starting point of classical political economy and of Rousseau's social contract, quote, which brings naturally independent, autonomous subjects into relation and connection by contract, end quote, are, in fact, projections back into an imaginary past of individuals as they appear within modern, quote, civil society in preparation since the 1500s, and making giant strides towards maturity in the 1700s, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. The error here for Marx is exactly the same as Hegel's on landed property, discussed in the last chapter. The treatment of concepts, quote, not as historical, but rather as eternal categories, end quote. Indeed, is but the other side of the same coin. For the process whereby, quote, property is, quote, freed from property's former, quote, political and social embellishments and associations, end quote, to achieve property's, quote, purely economic form, end quote, is the same process wherein individuals appear progressively detached from the communities through whose membership individuals previously became proprietors, or possessors of land, family, clan, Herrschaftsverhältnisse. They appear in bürgerliche Gesellschaft, bourgeois or civil society, for the first time as precisely mere individuals in, quote, dot-like isolation. But, quote, human beings become individuals only through the process of history. He appears originally as a species being, a clan being, a herd animal, end quote. Marx Grundrisse. It is specifically the social relations of capitalism, and in particular capitalism's social division of labor, which constitute individuals as apparently autonomous, freely contracting subjects, owners either of means of production or labor power. But for Marx, as later for Emile Durkheim, I heard Marcel Stutzler call who I had always called Emile Durkheim, and I put Durkheim into the French translator, or Durkheim into the French translator, and it is pronounced Durkheim according to Google Translate, but maybe that's incorrect. But I thought that was interesting that if that's the case, everybody pronounces this sociologist's name wrong. But for Marx, as later for Emile Durkheim, this appearance of individual autonomy, of lack of dependence on social relations, is ultimately illusory. The more the division of labor, which individualizes people, expands, the more socially interdependent individuals actually become. Given capitalism's inherent dynamism, ultimately such interdependence becomes global through the world market. Overt relations of personal dependency give way to, quote, objective dependency relations, end quote, quoted more fully above. Quote, the epoch which produces this standpoint, that of the isolated individual, is also that of precisely the hitherto most developed social, from this standpoint, general relations. The human being is in the most literal sense a zoon politikon, not merely a gregarious animal, but an animal which can individuate itself only in the midst of society, end quote. Marx Grundrisse. This objective interdependence may not be apparent because of the alienated forms, the fetishized appearance as relations between things, commodities, rather than people. It assumes under capitalism, but it is real. Accordingly, Smith's, Ricardo's, or Rousseau's, quote, natural individual is, quote, an ideal. Note again the use of this significant term. Marx had criticized Feuerbach in the same terms 10 years earlier. Quote, the abstract individual whom he analyzes belongs in reality to a particular form of society, end quote. In his essay of 1843 on the Jewish question, Marx elaborates on his proposition that, quote, egoistic man, the, quote, member of civil society, the, quote, abstract individual, whom we have been discussing, is, quote, the basis, the precondition of the political state, end quote. Marx develops his argument via a series of historical contrasts with feudal society. It is best to follow the text closely, for Marx's language is not always easy. Feudalism, quote, feudalism was directly political. That is to say, the elements of social life, for example, property or the family or the mode of labor, were raised to the level of political life in the form of seniority. I think that's how you said it. Seniority. Estates and corporations. In this form, they determine the relations of the individual to the state as a whole, i.e., his political relation. That is, his relation of separation and exclusion from the other components of society. Thus, the vital functions and conditions of civil society remained political, although political in the feudal sense. That is to say, they secluded the individual from the state as a whole, and they converted the particular relation of his corporation to the state as a whole into his general relation to the life of the nation, just as they converted his particular civil activity and situation into his general activity and situation. As a result of this organization, the unity of the state, and also the consciousness, will, and activity of this unity, the general power of the state, are likewise bound to appear as the particular affair of a ruler isolated from the people and of his servants. End quote. Marx, 1843. What Marx is saying, in more modern vocabularies, is something like this. In feudalism, civil and political, public and private coincided. Indeed, these very terms are anachronistic as applied to the medieval world, for such distinctions are precisely a product of bourgeois historical development. Individuals' civil statuses were at the same time political, and it would be meaningless to try to differentiate between public and private at the level of institutions. Thus, for instance, feudal lords were not merely property owners, and we have already seen the inappropriateness of that description of feudal lords, if property is taken in its modern sense, but suzerains who enjoy jurisdiction over their serfs and tenants. Feudal estates had distinct and differential privileges in law. In medieval England, for example, villeins had no access to the royal courts in matters affecting relations with their lord, while the nobility were exempt from corporal punishment. Most medieval parliaments were organized by estates. The king, conversely, was ideally expected, quote, to live off his own, end quote, and farmed taxes. This is the kind of thing Marx had in mind in his earlier quoted remark about, quote, privilege being the basis of medieval society. In this social context, a, quote, political sphere, a, quote, state, in the modern sense of the word, cannot be meaningfully be separated off from, quote, civil society. Nor can it be construed as the realm of the, quote, public interest, as distinct from, quote, private life. Feudalism recognized no such distinctions. Politics, quote, in the feudal sense, is rather the, quote, private affair of the ruler and his servants. The, quote, political nation, to use a term drawn from historiography. Though Marx does not say so here, the same is true of the polis of antiquity. For Aristotle, only the free can be citizens, And, quote, a citizen in the fullest sense is one who has a share in honors, end quote, associated with holding office in the polis. St. Paul, too, of course, escaped a whipping on the grounds that he was a civis Romanus. Bürgerliche Gesellschaft, civil or bourgeois society, fractures this identity of civil and political, public and private, in ways which profoundly alter the very meanings of the concepts of polity and society, making their modern distinction conceivable. In ancient and medieval political thought, society was rarely, if ever, theorized independently of the polis. It was conceptualized as a community of citizens, civitas, with a public political form, res publica. Marx continues, quote, the political revolution, which overthrew this sovereign state of affairs and raised state affairs to become affairs of the people, which constituted the political state as a matter of general concern, that is, as a real state, necessarily smashed all estates, corporations, guilds, and privileges, since they were all manifestations of the separation of the individual from the community. The political revolution thereby abolished the political character of civil society. The political revolution broke up civil society into its simple component parts. On the one hand, the individuals, on the other hand, the material and spiritual elements constituting the content of the life and social position of these individuals. It set free the political spirit, which had been, as it were, split up, partitioned, dispersed in the various blind alleys of feudal society. It gathered the dispersed parts of the political spirit, freed it from its intermixture with civil life, and established it as the sphere of the community, the general concern of the nation, ideally independent of those particular elements of civil life. A person's distinct activity and distinct situation in life were reduced to a merely individual significance. They no longer constituted the general relation of the individual to the state as a whole. Public affairs as such, on the other hand, became the general affair of each individual. The political function became the individual's general function. But the completion of the idealism of the state was at the same time the completion of the materialism of civil society. Throwing off the political yoke meant at the same time throwing off the bonds which restrained the egoistic spirit of civil society. Political emancipation was at the same time the emancipation of civil society from politics, from having any of the semblances of a universal content, end quote. 1843, Marx. In the bourgeois world, civil society ceases to be directly political. Or to use a formulation I would prefer, since it is less anachronistic than Marx's own, civil society as such is actually constituted and becomes a possible object of theorization for the first time as a society of formally free, equal, independent human individuals. Unlike in feudalism, individuals' differential material positions do not, in appearance at any rate, any longer coincide with differentiated political powers, statuses, or rights. Individuals can be conceived of Individuals' differential material positions can be conceived of as a private matter, irrelevant to one's public existence as a citizen. At the same time and correspondingly, an identifiable, quote, public sphere, the state, is also demarcated for the first time as, ideally, the domain of the general interest, in which all equally partake as citizens. In sum, then, for Marx, quote, political emancipation is the reduction of man on the one hand to a member of civil society, to an egoistic, independent individual, and on the other hand to a citizen, a juridical person, end quote. Marx, 1843. As later for Durkheim, Elias, or Foucault, state formation and individualization are complementary processes, entailing one another. The abstraction of the state and the abstraction of the individual originate in, quote, one and the same act. Now, this is evidently an ideotypical account, which at the least savagely truncates the protracted, uneven, and complex processes of bourgeois state formation. It is also in some respects undoubtedly misleading, if taken as a straightforward statement of historical fact. Real feudal societies are often differed considerably from Marx's archetype. In England, for example, state formation, and with state formation such notions as equality, of free men before a law which override seigneurial prerogatives, was well advanced long before anything that can reasonably be called a bourgeois economy had developed. Marx equally overstates the degree to which abstract equality of individuals was or is the basis of bourgeois political life. Property qualifications remain the explicit hierarchized criterion for successive 19th century English franchise extensions. For instance, while adult women did not gain the vote on the same terms as men until 1929, or equal rights to own property or make contracts until later still. The Equal Rights Amendment outlawing discrimination on the grounds of sex has yet to pass the U.S. Congress. For long, the, quote, individuals of whom Marx speaks, to take up again my arguments about patriarchy in the last section of Chapter 3, were specifically household heads, the household being a crystallization of age, gender, and property relations, but regarded as an analysis of the distinctive ideological forms. The legal and political superstructures, as I am using the term, of bourgeois society. Marx's observations remain, to my mind at least, extremely insightful. For he goes on to develop a critique of this political emancipation, which denies its substance. The burden of Marx's argument is that the political state, far from transcending the material inequalities of civil society, in fact, reproduces and reinforces the inequalities of civil society. Quote, far from abolishing these real distinctions, the state only exists on the presupposition of these real distinctions' existence, end quote. To anticipate later formulations, the state is a form of class rule. Specifically, the state is the form in which the modern bourgeoisie publicly organizes its social power. Now, in my last long quote from The Jewish Question, I capitalized two of Marx's phrases. Marx speaks of the political state as being, quote, ideally independent of the, quote, particular elements of civil life, end quote, and of the, quote, completion of the idealism of the state, end quote. Another passage in the same text elaborates on this theme of the state's ideality, drawing an instructive analogy with religion, in which, of course, Marx also persistently compared fetishism in the economic sphere. Quote, where the political state has attained its true development, man, not only in thought, in consciousness, but in reality, in life, leads a twofold life, a heavenly and earthly life. Life in the political community, in which he considers himself a communal being, and life in civil society, in which he acts as a private individual, regards other men as a means, degrades himself into a means, and becomes the plaything of alien powers. The relation of the political state to civil society is just as spiritual as the relation of heaven to earth. The political state stands in the same opposition to civil society, and it prevails over the latter in exactly the same way as religion prevails over the narrowness of the secular world, i.e., by likewise having always to acknowledge it, to restore it, and allow itself to be dominated by it. In his most immediate reality, in civil society, man is a secular being. Here, where he regards himself as a real individual, and is so regarded by others, he is a fictitious phenomenon. In the state, on the other hand, where man is regarded as a species being, he is the imaginary member of an illusory sovereignty, is deprived of his real individual life, and endowed with an unreal universality, end quote. We should take the religious analogy seriously, because for Marx, religion is the paradigm of alienated consciousness. Religion fetishizes the exemplars for fetishes elsewhere. Religion's fetishes are the exemplars for fetishes everywhere. Marx once famously remarked, in a text contemporary with the Jewish question, that, quote, criticism of religion is the premise of all criticism, end quote. What he is saying here, I think, amounts to much more than that the state's pretensions to be above classes are to be disbelieved. Marx's claim is that the institution of the political state as such is an illusory ideal community, an ideological fiction, built upon the construction of an equally fictitious social identity for the individual, that of the citizen. Individuals are citoyens only as, quote, abstract individuals. Individuals, in other words, divorced from the material circumstances and social relations which concretely make them what they are. The ideal state is predicated on the ideological denial of real individuality. Real differences between people are submerged in the ascription of, quote, unreal universality. In capitalism, the individual and the community are therefore simultaneously idealized. The bourgeois citizen is an imaginary member of an illusory sovereignty. The bourgeois citizen is, quote, an imaginary member of an illusory sovereignty, We cannot begin to understand Marx's thinking on the state, to my mind, unless we take these words in their literal sense. The state is an ideological representation of bourgeois society, an Erscheinungsform. In Philip Abrams' provocative adaptation of Durkheim, it is capitalism's, quote, distinctive collective misrepresentation, end quote. And individuals as identified and represented in all senses within the community of the state are not individuals as they really are. What the hell is going on here? For the Jewish question, then, the political state as such is without doubt an ideological form, an ideal superstructure on real relations in the sense argued above. But beyond its references to egoistic individuals, the Jewish question text offers no material analysis of the social relations which underpin this form. Later writings, however, do, but without sacrificing any of the essential insights of the Jewish question. The German ideology roots the, quote, illusory community of the state and law in particular class relations of bourgeois society, which it in turn sees as based in the division of labor. Quote, the division of labor implies the contradiction between the interest of the separate individuals and the communal interests of all individuals. And out of this very contradiction between the interests of the individual and the interests of the community, the latter takes an independent form as the state, divorced from the real interest of individual and community, and at the same time as an illusory communal life, always based, however, on the real ties, and especially on the classes already determined by the division of labor. End quote. Marx's German ideology. Specifically, Marx relates the fact that bourgeois power takes the characteristic form of domination through a political state and the rule of law to the circumstance that the bourgeoisie is the first social group in history truly to rule, quote, as a class, end quote. At first sight, this notion is odd, for did not previous forms of society also have ruling classes, feudal lords, ancient slaveholders, oriental potentates, and so on? Clearly they did, and Marx obviously does not mean to deny that pre-capitalist ruling strata lived off surplus labor. The contrast Marx has in mind is a narrower contrast between the social forms of rule, in particular between rule as a class and rule as an estate. In this sense, class, too, is a historical category. Rule as an estate, as we saw in Chapter 3, is based in personal relations of domination and servitude, as also is slavery. Personalized domination is in fact for Marx the norm in all pre-capitalist societies. The bourgeoisie, by contrast, rules impersonally, and is the first class in history to rule impersonally. In the context of the formal equality of all individuals. The form in which bourgeois social power is embodied is the, quote, purely economic and specifically alienated one of its property in the modern meaning of the word. Control over people and their labor is mediated through control over things. The ultimate expression of this impersonal social power is in money, the, quote, consummate fetish. In bourgeois society, according to the Grundrisse, quote, the reciprocal and all-sided dependence of individuals who are indifferent to one another forms their social connection. This social bond is expressed in exchange value. The power which each individual exercises over the activity of others or over social wealth exists in him as the owner of exchange values, of money. The individual carries his social power, as well as his bond with society, in his pocket, end quote, Marx Grundrisse. It is the materialization, the alienation of the social bond in the thing-like forms of commodities, money, and capital, which permits people to exercise power over one another indirectly and impersonally as abstract individuals, rather than directly and personally as master and slave or lord and serf. In Capital, Marx observes that it was on precisely these grounds, quote, social power becomes in the private power. In Capital, Marx observes that it was on precisely these grounds, quote, social power becomes the private power of private persons, end quote, that the ancients denounced money as, quote, subversive of the economic and moral order of things, end quote. An order seen by, for instance, Aristotle as one of natural and personalized hierarchy. The German ideology relates the existence of both state and law to this, quote, impersonal and alienated form of class domination through, quote, property alone. Quote, pure private property has cast off all semblance of a communal institution and has shut off the state from any influence on the development of property. To this modern private property corresponds the modern state. By the mere fact that it is a class and no longer an estate, the bourgeois is forced to organize itself no longer locally, but nationally, and to give a general form to its mean average interests. Through the emancipation of private property from the community, the state has become a separate entity, beside and outside civil society. But it is nothing more than the form of organization which the bourgeoisie necessarily adopt, both for internal and external purposes, for the mutual guarantee of their property and interests. End quote. Marx. Marx says exactly the same of law. Quote, in the law, the bourgeoisie must give themselves a general expression precisely because they rule as a class. End quote. The clue to the necessity of bourgeois rule, taking the form of an ideally independent state, enforcing the rule of law, lies for Marx in the atomized vociferous character character, precisely the individualized nature of the bourgeois class itself. This in turn follows from the specific form of social division of labor between independent commodity producers, in which capitalist production is based. The individuals of the bourgeoisie, Marx considers, quote, form a class only insofar as the individuals of the bourgeoisie have to carry on a common battle against another class. Otherwise, the individuals of the bourgeoisie are on hostile terms with each other as competitors, end quote. The individuals of the bourgeoisie's common class interests can be secured only by maintaining conditions, above all the defense of individual property rights, in which they can continue to act freely as individuals, each pursuing his own private interests in apparent isolation from one another. This entails both the safeguarding of bourgeois right against the political and moral economies of other classes, whether aristocratic or proletarian, and the maintenance of equal right among bourgeois individuals themselves. The, quote, rule of law is the paradigm form of such regulation. The fact that the fact that the bourgeois class enforce their will in the form of law, and at the same time make it independent of the personal arbitrariness of each individual among them, does not depend on their idealistic will. Their personal rule must at the same time assume the form of average rule. Their personal power is based on conditions of life which, as they develop, are common to many individuals, and the continuance of which they, as ruling individuals, have to maintain against others, and at the same time to maintain that they hold good for everybody. The expression of this will, which is determined by their common interests, is law. It is precisely because individuals who are independent of one another assert themselves and their own will, and because on this basis their attitude to one another is bound to be egotistical, that self-denial is made necessary in law and right, self-denial in the exceptional case, and self-assertion of their interests in the average case. End quote. Marx. Marx's discussion of the English Factory Acts in Capital Volume 1 admirably illustrates this thesis. Certainly, he stresses the degree to which parliamentary limitation of hours of labor represented a victory for the, quote, political economy of the working class, end quote. Law is there a theater of class struggle, as much as a form of class rule. But he is equally sensitive to the, quote, cry of the capitalists for equality in the conditions of competition, end quote. The German ideology argues comparably that, quote, the representative system of modern parliamentary democracy is, quote, a very specific product of modern bourgeois society, which is as inseparable from bourgeois society as is the isolated individual of modern times, end quote. Marx's later writings extend the argument to the actual forms of law themselves, and anchor these more directly in the phenomenal forms of commodity circulation. Pashukanis has developed this theme in Marx with considerable brilliance, if also at times undue abstractness. Quote, capital logic theorists, who can sometimes be subjected to the same criticism, have argued similarly regarding the characteristic social forms of bourgeois democracy, such as Holloway and Picciotto, 1978. So I shall be brief. For the Grundrisse, the juridical subject, the free, autonomous, sovereign individual, is implicit in the relation of commodity exchangers. In the very act of exchange, quote, they are stipulated for each other as, and prove themselves to be, equals, and there enters in addition to the quality of equality, that of freedom, end quote. Quote, although individual A feels a need for the commodity of individual B, individual A does not appropriate individual B's commodity by force, nor vice versa. Individual A and individual B recognize one another reciprocally as proprietors, as persons whose will penetrates their commodities. Accordingly, the juridical moment of the person enters here, as well as that of freedom, insofar as it is contained in the former. No one seizes hold of another's property by force. Each divests himself of his property voluntarily. End quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Marx goes on to argue that, quote, the exchange of exchange values is the productive real basis of all equality and freedom, end quote. And, quote, as pure ideas, equality and freedom are merely the idealized expressions of this basis, as developed in juridical, political, social relations. They are merely this basis to a higher power. End quote. Equality and freedom presuppose relations of production, lacking in the medieval and ancient world, which rested on, quote, direct forced labor, end quote. Capital argues similarly that, quote, the notion of human equality, end quote, can only acquire, quote, the fixity of a popular prejudice, end quote, when, quote, the dominant relation between man and man is that of owners of commodities, end quote. In this sense, the market is a very Eden of the innate rights of man, where, quote, alone rule freedom, equality, property, and Bentham, end quote. The, quote, attributes of the juridical person, end quote, then, are, quote, precisely those of the individual engaged in exchange, end quote. However, Marx argues, and here we return to the, quote, ideality of superstructures, that the sphere of exchange is merely the, quote, surface process, end quote, of bourgeois society, quote, beneath which, however, in the depths, entirely different processes go on, in which the apparent individual equality and liberty disappear, end quote. He, of course, here has in mind the imminently unequal, quote, exchange of labor power for wages, out of which arises an unrequited surplus value. Polemicizing against French socialists who see this as a perversion of the original equality of the exchange relationship, Marx argues that capital is, quote, inherent in exchange value, and wage labor in commodity-producing labor. The possibility of the, quote, perversion is, in other words, given in the original relationship itself. Failing to see this is a, quote, utopian inability to grasp the necessary difference between the real and the ideal form of bourgeois society, end quote. The latter being, quote, only the inverted projection of this reality, end quote. Such are, quote, superstructures. Section 7. Let me now try to pull together the strands of this argument. Nothing I have said or quoted from Marx is in any way intended to deny the reality of organs, institutions, or agencies of government or law as such. That would be absurd. It is the reality of their apparent separation from capitalism's, quote, economic structure, its essential relations, which is at issue. Marx's analysis of legal and political superstructures, I believe, hinges upon 2 points, both of which are very subversive of so-called traditional historical materialism. First, Marx seeks to establish that the regulative agencies of state and law are substantially internal to capitalism's, quote, base itself. That is to say, they are but forms of the social relations within and between classes, division of labor and labor-capital relation, upon which the possibility of capitalist economy is predicated. Their appearance of independence notwithstanding, state and law are in reality, quote, the form in which the individuals of a ruling class assert their common interests, in which the whole civil society of an epoch is epitomized, end quote. Marx insists, moreover, that state and law are necessary forms of bourgeois rule, quote, individuals who rule in these conditions, leaving aside the fact that their power must assume the form of the state, have to give their will a universal expression as the will of the state and as law, end quote. State and law are thus essential relations of capitalist production. In the sense elaborated in my last chapter, it could not proceed in their absence. We should pay close attention to Marx's language when he says that civil society, quote, must assert itself in its foreign relations as nationality, and inwardly must organize itself as state, end quote, and speaks of civil society, quote, in its action as state, end quote. This does not sound like an external relation. This argument implies, among other things, that the class relations of capitalism cannot adequately be delineated, just as the, quote, economic level, This argument implies, among other things, that the class relations of capitalism cannot adequately be delineated just at the economic level, as Cohen's supposedly rechtsfrei ownership relations. State and law are intrinsic to the totality of social relations, which actually make up the seemingly, quote, impersonal power of bourgeois property, which maintain a social form in which domination can appear to take purely, quote, economic forms. They are constitutive of bourgeois class rule. It could not exist otherwise. The bourgeoisie, in Max Weber's useful phrase, is the, quote, national citizen class, end quote. Marx himself observes of the notion of citizenship, quote, it should read, domination of the bourgeoisie, end quote. Anderson, too, must be qualified here. I quoted him above on the novelty of the, quote, economy, being a, quote, formally self-contained order, end quote, in capitalism, which, quote, superstructures of state and law are, quote, external preconditions. This is fine and grasps an important contrast between capitalism and previous forms of society, providing we remember that although the novelty is real enough, the externality of these spheres is merely apparent. This brings me to Marx's second point. For Marx is equally clear that in capitalism, these essential relations manifest themselves in Erscheinungsformen, which conceal their true substance. The appearance of the so-called economic sphere as an external objective realm is one side of that world of illusion whose fetishes we have sufficiently explored in the previous chapters. As E.P. Thompson has observed, quote, the very category of economics, the notion that it is possible to isolate economic from non-economic social relations, that all human obligations can be dissolved except the cash nexus, was the product of a particular phase of capitalist evolution, end quote. The appearance of the political state, the, quote, illusory community, peopled by abstract individuals, equal citizens of the polity, and subjects of the law, is the other side of the same phenomenon. The link between the two is the real subject of the commodity exchange, the bourgeois. When Marx speaks of law and state as, quote, superstructures, it is this bewitched world of appearance that I believe he is referring. Far from inscribing in his own theory, via a metaphor of, quote, levels, the reifications of capitalist society, the base superstructure metaphor is intended to show them to be just that. The real state is an essential dimension of capitalism's class relations, quote, the combination of one class over against another, end quote. Its ideal appearance is of, quote, an illusory community, which took on an independent existence, end quote. It is the latter Marx calls a, quote, superstructure, in order precisely to show up its illusoriness, its, quote, ideal character, and deny its substantial independence. Regrettably, Marx never did write that critique of politics and political economy, but his later writings are thoroughly consonant with the critique he developed in the 1840s, arguing both the internality of the real state to capitalism's class relations and the insubstantiality of its, quote, ideal independence. Capital, for instance, the book Capital, for instance, asserts that the use of state power is, quote, an essential element of the so-called primitive accumulation, end quote, whose methods, quote, all employ the power of the state and the concentrated and organized force. Primitive accumulation's methods, quote, all employ the power of the state, the concentrated and organized force of society, end quote. For Grundrisse, Likewise, speaking of England, quote, governments, for example, of Henry VII, the Eighth, etc., appear as conditions of the historic dissolution process of feudal relations, and as makers for the conditions of existence of capital, end quote. Part 8 of Capital, Volume 1, details some of what Marx has in mind, both the Civil War in France and the critique of the Gotha program. Texts of the 1870s continue to anchor the, quote, political state, quote, the state insofar as it forms a special organism separated from society through the division of labor, end quote. Quote, a state separate of and independent from society, end quote, in the specifically capitalist division of labor. Marx also continues emphatically to deny the substantial reality of this separability. For the Civil War, the Second Empire, whilst, quote, at first view, apparently the usurpatory dictatorship of the governmental body over society itself, arising alike above and humbling all classes, end quote, is in fact, quote, the only possible state form in which the appropriating class can continue to sway it over the producing class, end quote. Quote, the last degraded and only possible form of that class ruling, end quote. The very separation of, quote, civil society and, quote, political state is an ideological superstructure on capitalism's component relations, an ideological form in which they are masked, which simultaneously idealizes individual and community. Two passages, one from 1843 and the other from 1871, bring out well the underlying continuities and the animating emancipatory vision in Marx's thinking here. Quote, quote, only when man has recognized and organized his forces propre as social forces, and consequently no longer separates social power from himself in the shape of political power, only then will human emancipation have been accomplished. End quote. 1843. Quote, the Paris Commune was a revolution not against this or that legitimate constitutional, republican, or imperialist form of state power. The Paris Commune was a revolution against the state itself, of this supernaturalist abortion of society, a resumption by the people for the people of its own social life, end quote. Marx, 1871. Cohen at one point in his book remarks that, quote, even the mature idea of the political superstructure has some analogy with the doctrine of commodity fetishism. Too true. But why then? Cohen at one point in his book remarks that, quote, even the mature idea of the political superstructure has some analogy with the doctrine of commodity fetishism, end quote. Too true. But why then perpetuate the fetish with the analytic categories of historical materialism itself?